Acts chapter 4, we want to look at verse 5 and 6. Read verse 5 and 6 this morning. Acts chapter 4. Peter, of course, has gone by the gate beautiful into the temple for the hour of prayer. It's the hour of sacrifice as well. He's grabbed a hold of the hand of the lame beggar and has yanked him to his feet. And in the name of Jesus speaks the word that causes and releases all the power of God that is focused on this man to bring him into perfect soundness. He enters into the temple for the first time. He's dancing around, walking. It's quite a demonstration. Crowd all knows about it. He's not a visitor from out of town. He's been there he's over 40 years of age, been begging, and everybody knows him. So the crowd is clustered around. There's probably at this point maybe 25,000, 30,000 people in the temple itself. The rumor spreads. Over 5,000 men have gathered around, besides the women and children, around the Solomon's porch. Peter is preaching. That is, he's giving an exhortation. And he gives this phenomenal exhortation. Right in the middle of it, the leaders of the temple we've been calling the Alliance. They're the priest, the captain of the temple, and the Sadducees. They all come together as a body. Probably was something like maybe 50 of them came, burst through the crowd, shut the thing down, grabbed hold of the apostles, Peter and John, and brought them back and put them in jail for the night. The rumor now, the word has now been spread, and they're going to have a special meeting of a special group. And that group is going to be an extended group, actually. It's not going to be the normal Sanhedrin group, because what is happening is of real concern. It's just awful when this Jesus guy just won't die. And he just won't stay dead after he dies. And it's just causing quite a problem. So they've got together to deal with this issue. And he spends a lot of time giving us a lot of space, giving us the content, the constituency of this group. And it begins in verse 5. And it came to pass on the next day that the rulers, elders, and scribes, as well as Annas the high priest, Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and as many as were family of the high priest, were gathered together at Jerusalem. Let's bow in prayer. Lord, what would you want to do in us? And if I understand anything about the heart of this passage, oh God, don't let me become one of these guys. Please don't let me just hang around the church and be a part of the church for so long that I become one of these guys. Please don't let me just know the knowledge of Christianity and the function and how the temple works and how the ceremonies operate and be even in leadership and positions of power and decision making and end up like one of these guys. Don't let me do it in my home. Don't let me do it in my society. Don't let me do it in the church. Don't let me do it in my own life and my own personal existence. Don't let me. I don't want any characteristic that these guys have. Anything that they're like, I don't want. Save me. Please save me. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. When you read verse 5, the rulers, elders, and scribes, that seems to be a favorite statement for the gospel writers in relationship to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is made up of 70 individuals, plus the high priest who had the deciding vote. Normally there were 35 Pharisees, 35 Sadducees, and then the high priest could break the vote if they were in conflict. So the Sanhedrin is made up of this constituency. And as you look at it, you find out they are the ruling body of all of Israel. Now, the truth of the matter is, while over all of Israel, they were the ruling body and the deciding factor, they didn't have a lot of influence outside of Judea. So Galilee, you understand, was 100 miles away from Jerusalem, which was right at the heart of Judea, the territory of Judea. So outside of Judea, this this group really didn't extend that far. So Galilee was, basically out of their reach, out of their influence. Well, if Jesus would have just minded his business and stayed in Galilee, he wouldn't have had any problem. He could have survived. The cross probably wouldn't have happened. These boys would have maybe backed off. But see, he kept going into their territory, and he kept pestering them, which is part of where the conflict all came with Jesus and this Sanhedrin, who is definitely responsible for the issue of crucifying him. They, of course, are the religious leaders of all of Israel. So they're responsible for the spiritual life. They're responsible for the maintaining of the temple. They're responsible for keeping the ceremonies going. They're responsible for whatever laws are going to be in place. They're responsible for the taxation and all the money and operation of the temple. But they also are the political power of the hour, as you would know, because Judaism is all set up not only on religion, but on the very politics of religion itself. And it's all intermixed. So the whole politics of the country revolves around the temple and your involvement in that. And these boys have control of all of that. In other words, these boys are the ones who are in league with Rome because Rome is dominating their country. So here they are. They have to deal with Rome, which is the political aspect of this whole thing. So this is the most powerful group with the most powerful men, the most wealthy men, the men who are really pulling the strings of everything that's going on in Israel. This is no joke coming before this group. When you look at Israel's history, from the time Israel started to the time of Jesus, and you take their history and you slice it into thirds, which, by the way, Matthew does in chapter 1 in the genealogy. When you slice it into thirds, what you discover is the first third of Jewish history, Israel did not have a king. Well, who told them what to do? Well, God did. Which is something of a prototype of the way life is supposed to be, and the way God really wanted Israel to be all the time. Israel was never intended to have a man king. God was going to be their king. And do you know the advantage of that? You don't have to support a big palace. You don't have to have an army. You don't have to do all this stuff. Taxation, the only taxation that they had revolved around the temple and the tithe that was given. And God was maintained within that tabernacle. And they had no man king, because God was going to provide for them. See, the genius of that is that God has in his mind, he wants to provide for you, that you don't have to provide for him. Now, do you know how radical that is in all of religion? Hey, I got this stone-faced God. I carved him out of a piece of rock, and he's sitting over here. And guess who has to take care of that dude? I do. I got to get him an umbrella when it rains. I got him bringing food when he's hungry, because the old boy just sits there and looks at me. But see, our God is not like that. He says, you don't need to contribute to me. You don't need to give to me. You don't need, I don't need you. You need me. And I'm going to provide everything you need. And he proved it with Israel in their first third of their history. Oh, he gave them water out of the rock. Can you imagine thousands and thousands of people wandering through a wilderness who never planted a garden and never planted a seed and didn't do anything about drilling wells and had no land and just were nomads traveling from place to place, and yet they had plenty of food. There was quail out of the bush. There was manna from the sky. There was water out of the rock. God, oh, you ladies would love this. God caused their shoes not to wear out, so they only needed one pair. Whoa! Isn't that phenomenal? Because God said, hey, I'll provide for you, man. I'll provide for you. And when it came to strategies of war, what about our enemies? Oh, we got to have an army. No, you don't. In fact, they had a large army, the old Gideon scene, large army, cut it down, ended up with a little over 300 men, and God defeats the enemy. Because God has strategized their wars, strategized their defense. Who would have ever thought up of the idea, march around the city 7 times, walls will fall in? Who would have ever come up with a crazy idea like that? God did. And the advantages of having God as your king are just overwhelming. And why they couldn't see that, I have no idea. Oh, yeah, I do. because the same thing that was in them is in me. And they found themselves belly aching. This manna. How many ways can you fix manna? In fact, you know that the Hebrew word for manna, what it really means is, what's that? Yeah, when it first came down, they looked at it and said, what's that? And that's what they named it. From then on, it was always called, what's that? Interesting, isn't it? And they complained, and they complained, and they complained, and they belly ached. And you know, when you've got thousands of people belly aching and all pulling on you at the same time, poor Moses is about to pull out his hair. He said, this is too much. Man, this is too much. And he came to God and said, hey, God, you either help me out or I'm going to commit suicide. Well, it wasn't quite like that. But he did come to God and say, listen, I got to have help on this. This is too much to carry. I can't handle this. So God said, here's what we're going to do. I want you to select 70 elders from Israel. 70 elders. Sanhedrin. This was their birth. Numbers chapter 11, verse 16. Or is it chapter 16, verse 11? I don't know. But anyhow, select 70 elders from Israel. Men you can trust. Men that got their head on straight. Men that are the most faithful. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the Spirit of God that dwells on you, and I'm going to give it to them. Now, we know in the Old Testament, surely this is clear in your mind, we know in the Old Testament that the Holy Spirit was not absent. It isn't like he just showed up at Pentecost. Whoa, where you been? It isn't like that. He was all over the Old Testament. He was filling men in the Old Testament as well, but not like the New Testament sense, not the New Covenant sense. See, the Old Testament filling was on a handful of men, 70 at this point, plus Moses, and it was task-oriented. In other words, he came upon them, not for intimacy, not to empower them for life, not that kind of thing. He came to empower them for a task. So God said, Moses, the Spirit of God that rests on you for leadership, I'm going to give to those 70 boys. And those 70 guys are to operate as you operate. Now, there were 3 things that were really important in their leadership ability then, due to the Spirit of God that came to rest upon them. One is that they're going to know the power of God. And in knowing the power of God, that causes you to make different decisions than you would make otherwise. See, normally I wouldn't come up against you, you Goliath guy. But, hey, because I'm only a David. But if I know the power of God, I'll look you in the eyeball. Because I know the power of God. So these 70 men of Israel had the power of God, knew the power of God through the Spirit of God. These 70. That was important. Not only did they know the power of God, but they had the mind of God. In other words, they were to be the translation between what God thinks and what you're going to do. And they would take the mind of God and bring it to the people, which was the function of Moses, which is now the function of the 70, the Sanhedrin. So in the leadership of Israel, they were to march in the power of God, displaying and communicating the very mind of God itself. And they were to focus their entire lives on the needs of the people, which is the third thing. In other words, they weren't to live for themselves. This was not a manipulation of the power of God for my own selfish ends and for my own selfish needs. They were not to use their authority for their own desires. They were not to use the power they had over Israel to make decisions, to get all the good jobs for themselves, to do all the good things that they wanted, to make their own lives comfortable. They were to use the power of God, knowing the mind of God, to aid the people of God. That was their function. And it's the beginning of the Sanhedrin. That was the first third of Israel's history. Now, when you come into the second third of Israel's history, what you discover is they've got a man king. The Sanhedrin is gone. They've pushed that whole operation aside and said, we don't want that anymore. We want a man king. And where did that come from? The people got together and came to Samuel and demanded a man king. We want to rule ourselves, is what they were saying. We want to select one of our group, and we want a say in our own affairs. I know God's been good. We're not against him. He's okay. Nobody's knocking God. God, you've done a good job, but we want you to retire. We'll give you a gold watch. And listen, we've got a special little place we've built for you over here called the Holy of Holies. We got this great big veil. Go in there. We'll come and visit you once a year. And we'll come every Sunday morning and sing to you. And you can hear us. It'll be great. And hey, but don't bother us. We want to run our own show. And if we have a real need that we can't handle, we'll ask you and you can get involved. But we want you to step back into an advisor position, into a position of retirement. It's not that we're against you. We want to worship you. We'll believe in you. Hey, everything's just like it was, only we just want to do our own thing. And I say, chop their heads off. Except there would go mine. Because that's exactly what I've done in my life. See, God, you're okay, and I don't mind you intervening and taking care of a few things. And when I have a real problem, I'll cry out to you. But in the meantime, I'd like to run my own show, go where I want to go, be what I want to be, do what I want to do. So I'd like to be my own king with you aiding me in what I desire. So see, it isn't that I don't believe in God. I do. Yeah, I come to church. So they dethrone God and enthrone themselves. After all, we want to do what we want to do. We want to do it the way we want to do it. And you know, I do have some good opinions. And I've got my rights. Now, get this. This is so hilarious. Because a people who said, we want to be free to do what we want to do without having God breathing down our neck all the time. When they did that, you know what happened to them? Captivity. Nebuchadnezzar came down, grabbed a hold of the whole outfit, took them out of their country, killed a few of them, hey, slapped some of them upside the head, and took their young men, and they became in Babylonian captivity. Don't you think it's ironic that when a guy does what he wants to do, he ends up trapped? And a guy who stands tall and set and says, I have a right and I'll be free, ends up slaved. Well, bless God, I'll drink if I want to. Whoops, I'm an alcoholic and now I can't quit. I'll take drugs if I want. Whoops, now I'm hooked and can't give it up. And the very thing that I said I wanted to be free to do, I end up not being free to do at all. Because I'm trapped and can't quit. And you can just go down the list. Well, I have a right to make money. Yeah, make money. Oh, I see dollar bills on your forehead, in the wrinkles in your forehead. Why? It's dominated you. It's controlling you now. You can't give it up. So whatever you give your life to, in other words, you're going to be a slave to something. So they said, we want to be free. We want to run our own show. We want to be our own king. And the minute they did that, captivity. Second, third. Then you come to the last third, the third one of Israel's history, which brings you into the time of Jesus. Now, Babylonian captivity, of course, wiped out the kingship thing, all that's gone. Now they're back in their homeland. And when they came back into their homeland, Nebuchadnezzar and Ezra and, not Nebuchadnezzar, Nehemiah and Ezra, they rebuilt the temple. And in the process of putting that whole thing together again, they discovered the laws of God. This is why we got messed up, the law of God. Let's go back to the old days. And they reestablished the Sanhedrin, 70 elders, and reinstituted the law. And it was to be governed by this 70 Sanhedrin. And the kingship is gone, because they're not allowed to have that anyway. So here they are. Now, by the time you get to Jesus' day, Rome is dominating the whole world. And Rome actually was pretty neat. Because Rome came in and conquered a country and said, hey, you don't have to dress like us. Hey, you don't have to believe in our gods. Hey, you don't have to have our customs, our culture. Hey, you don't have to play our music. We don't care. Be who you are. You can have your own culture. You can have your own customs. You can have your own religion. You can worship your own gods. You can operate your church the way you want to. You can do just what you've always done. We don't care. We only require two things out of you. Number one, pay taxes, which were really heavy. And number two, don't cause any trouble. So Israel, that was a genius for Israel. Because Israel could maintain their worship in one God. They could go right on with their temple. They could go right on with their rulership. They could maintain their Sanhedrin. Now, it's going to become important in this study, not today, but in the future, for you to remember that while they could maintain their own order and maintain their own structure and maintain their own Sanhedrin and maintain their own temple, that the high priest, they recognized the high priest as over all of this, and he had to be selected and approved by Rome because he was the most powerful man of all. So Rome had to put their rubber stamp on the guy who was going to be high priest. So by the time you get here, they're operating their own program. They're doing their own thing. They're all under the domination of Rome. So this group is in league with Rome, has linked arms because all the commerce, all the business, because this is the wealthy group, all the business, it's all linked in with Rome and keeping Rome happy. And what does Rome want? What does Rome not want? Revolution. And who is this Jesus guy who keeps stirring things up? So you can see the conflict. So this group, this is phenomenal, folks. This group who says, hey, we want to rule, we want to maintain, we want to keep things on an even keel. This group has brought Peter and John in, and the trial is going on. Now, in our passage, verse 5, it came to pass on the next day that their rulers, elders, and scribes. If you looked at this in the Greek, you would discover that there is an article before each one of those. In other words, it isn't just ruler, it's the ruler. It isn't just elder, it's the elder. And it isn't just scribe, it's the scribes. So it's the rulers, the elders, and these scribes. Now, I'm not sure that you can make a lot out of that in the Greek language, that really becomes all that significant. But in our thought process, in my thought process, that highlights these boys. They are the big boys. I want you to get this emphasis. They are the big boys. They're the boys that are on top of this whole thing. And they are responsible for all the leadership of Israel. Now, the word ruler is used 37 times in the New Testament. It's only used once for Jesus. It's used several times for demonic rulers. The rest of the time, it refers to these rulers. In other words, it's somebody who's in charge. The idea of elders is the presbyters. It's the Greek word. And the elders are lay members who are of the wealthy families, who are kind of dominant in the community and very influential, and they're the guys you come to ask advice. They are in the Sanhedrin. So you got these rulers, the officers of Israel, they're on the Sanhedrin. You got the elders, the laymen, the wealthy ones, they're in the Sanhedrin. And you got the scribes. Now the scribes are those who exegete. They're the ones who take the scriptures and pull it apart and make it make sense. So they're the teachers, the interpreters. They're the ones who even became the lawyers, so that when you got into trouble and wanted to go to court, you took a scribe who could interpret the law properly for the court scene. So that's this group, and they're here in the Sanhedrin as well. And the intent of all of this is that this group, ladies and gentlemen, was to have the Spirit of God dwelling on them. They don't. This group is to have the mind of God and direct the people in the thinking of God. And they don't. This group is to have their focus to be the needs of the people and meeting their needs. And they're focused on themselves. They have lost their intent. In 3 arenas. I want to list them for you. Number 1, authority. Authority. See, the very question that they're asking, They've gotten together, this group, Sanhedrin, and in verse 7, the whole issue is this: by what power or by what name have you done this? Now there is a recognition going on in the lives of the Sanhedrin and the men of the Sanhedrin that they recognize they don't have the power to do this kind of thing, and that Peter and John don't have the power to do this thing, and that something is going on here that is beyond normal, that is greater than they are, and they are recognizing in the passage that this power, in fact, is found in the word have done. Did you look at the question? By what power or by what name have you done? Have done this. It's the Greek word poieo. In other words, we recognize something is going on in you that is beyond the normal doing kind of thing. That this isn't a product of your hands, that something's happening beyond you, and that a miracle has taken place. But they couldn't deny it. The guy's standing right there. And the miracle has taken place because there is a power that is happening that is beyond you, and they're recognizing that power. I'm not sure what they thought. Seems a little ironic to me. Did they think that Peter and John were going to talk about some kind of incantations? Did you think of some magical formula? Did they think, oh, we came up with this hocus pocus, up and down, in and out, around and around, and then you light this candle, and then you sprinkle this powder that has come from the grinding of a moose horn. And they say, oh, really? Write that all down for us. They probably would have bought that. Because you see, the message of Jesus had been preached again and again and again and again and again and again. And didn't they know these boys were going to look them right in the eye and say, hey, it's Jesus, guys. That the power by which this is going to be done is Jesus. But you see, this forms, and this is so phenomenal, this forms a pattern of evangelism in the New Testament. I got a little ticked off because I went to all these conferences on evangelism, teaching you how to grow a church. And here's how to win your community. And somebody in that conference would always get up and say, I want to take you back to the book of Acts. And we want to establish the biblical New Testament pattern for growing a church. And so I'm sitting on the edge of my seat. There is no New Testament pattern. But if there is a pattern, the only pattern you can pick up in the book of Acts is not house churches. Let's all go back to our homes, and we'll meet in our homes, and we'll all eat together every night. Well, they did that. But that wasn't being established as any kind of a pattern for evangelism. I mean, hey, maybe it works. Well, fine, do it. I'll come over when you invite me. See, it's not that. So it's not that kind of a deal. But the pattern that's established, this is a pattern in the book of Acts. Every time there's evangelism going on, you know what takes place? God does something. Wham! I mean, he just out of the blue. I mean, whoa! He pulls some big deal off that just puts everybody on their face. In this case, it's a lame beggar who's been yanked to his feet that everybody knows, and the guy's running all over the place, and we're all saying, whoa, this is no fake. And when God gets done doing something so phenomenal that he's got everybody's attention, you know what happens next? Oh, he has somebody there to give a testimony. So, oh, I want to tell you how this happened. Oh, Jesus. And the guy testifies about Jesus, and people get saved. That's the New Testament pattern. God never starts out with preaching. Preaching always follows something that has happened that is so powerful, it just knocks your socks off. And then preaching follows. Then salvation comes after that. For instance, at Pentecost, here's 120 people talking in 15 languages, dialects that they don't even know. And the whole crowd is going, whoa! And when they get done doing that, Peter stands up and says, let me explain it to you. Jesus! And 3,000 get saved. Now here we've got the same thing going on. Miracle takes place. Everybody going, whoa! And Peter says, hey, Jesus! And 5,000 get saved. And that is repeated every time. Oh, here's a Philippi jail scene. And backs are bleeding and hands in stock. And whoa, we're singing at midnight. And yeah, probably my singing would do that. Earthquake! So here you got this earthquake taking place. And a Philippi jailer comes in and goes, whoa! And he said, no problem, we're all here, and talks to Jesus, and the guy gets saved. See, it happens every single time. So it might be that if we're going to win this community, the only way we are going to do it, it's going to have to start with God doing something. Whoa! Well, what would you recommend? Well, I've been praying for a tornado to come right down Main Street, Lebanon, and No. Why? Because that wouldn't do it. That happened in Zany, Ohio, and it didn't get anybody saved there. Well, bless God, if we had some terrorists, that's I'll tell you, who got in an airplane and came right down on, woo, and mashed that, we'd all, and churches did swell the next Sunday for one Sunday. So that didn't work. Well, suppose we had some healing of cancer. Well, I can take you to a dozen places where people will testify of, and that didn't seem to. Well, what kind of miracle would shake our community? Wouldn't it be something if we have become so dull, if we become so hooked on pills, wouldn't it be something if our thinking has become so sluggish that God would do startling things and we go, see, what would it take in your life for God just to literally do something so big that you'd go, whoa, and then we could talk to you about Jesus, just say, I'm in. Could I make a suggestion? How about loving me? That would take a miracle for you to love me. For you to treat me like a brother when I'm not a brother? For you to forgive me when I'm not worthy of forgiveness? For you to embrace me when I don't and I shouldn't? For you not to give me what I deserve? But to give me grace? See, I'm finding that the miracle that our community wants is not the miracle of, oh, heal of cancer, good for you. Oh, I believe. I'm finding they blow that off, man. I'm finding the tornado thing flood our town. But I'm finding that day after day after day after day, loving you when you don't deserve it, it's such a phenomenal miracle for our society that it's absolutely mind-boggling. And I'm also finding it's evident of the Spirit of God being upon 70, and they have the mind of God, and they're focusing on the needs of others. And this group lost that. We dare not. So they're recognizing power. There's no question about that something has taken place, but in the second step of this, they're resisting that power. It's in the statement itself as well. By what power or by what name have you done this? The very asking of the question says, we're not buying in because we know what you're going to say. After all, again, they've preached Jesus time after time after time after time. And again, it's so interesting. If it had been incantations, if it had been incense, it had been some magical formula, they would have bought into that. They'd have put it in the local newspaper. They'd have bought into that. But it wasn't that. It was Jesus, and they just don't want to buy into Jesus. But then you come to the realization. See, this realization that what are you going to do with this? There stands the guy. Indisputable. A miracle. And you can't. What are you going to do with him? In fact, they admit that. Look down at verse 16. What shall we say? What shall we do to these men? For indeed a notable miracle has been done through them, is evident to all who dwell in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. See, wouldn't it be something if God would do something through us that would be so phenomenal that our community would say, that your kids would say, that your neighbor would say, that your friends would say, we can't deny this. God is doing something. That's critical to this scene. See, Jesus has come face to face again with this group. You have no idea what that does to me. This is the group that killed him. He's still after him. This is a group that's blown him off time after time. And his stubbornness, he's still after him. This is a group that you want to wipe your hands of and say, hey, I'm done with you. And he's still after him. Do you know that after they crucified him, you know what God did? God got a bunch of Roman soldiers, the elite special forces of the Roman Empire, and got them to guard the dead body. And an angel came down and scared them so bad they fainted. And when they woke up, the tomb was empty and the body was gone. And they ran to these guys. And from the lips of a bunch of Roman pagans, God gave them another witness and said, hey, Jesus just raised from the dead, boys. See, if some preacher had come, they'd have blown him off. They didn't have a chance to. But this came from Roman pagans who had no advantage. And God was giving them a witness. And you know what they did? Shut him down, man. Gave him money to go tell a lie. That's how stubborn these boys are. And yet here, can you believe it? God's giving them another opportunity. A lame man, healed, running around. Drag him in. Here's these boys. Jesus, and Jesus is in their face again. Whew. The old poem, man called him the hound of heaven. He's got your scent. He's on your trail. Won't give you up. Hunting you down. Nip it at your heels. You can run. You can't hide. That's this Jesus. That's this Jesus, guys. That's this Jesus. He just won't turn you loose. Hey! It's not going to turn you loose. Hey! It's coming after you. Hey, do what you will. He's hounding you down. He's hounding you down. He won't give up until you are the spiritual individual he's dreamed you could be. Well, I have. I know, but he won't quit. I've gone. I know, but he'll go there too, just to get you. This is our Jesus. Jesus, don't let me be like these guys. Can I just be yours? And Jesus, when you came to them, you didn't come in theology, you came in reality. And while they talked about you didn't exist because they'd killed you, your presence was all over them. And they couldn't deny it. And they looked at the apostles and said, oh, they're under the influence of Jesus, who isn't even supposed to exist now. You have brought to our life Such a powerful, overwhelming expression of yourself day after day after day after day. That we are driven to the wall as these boys were. Having to admit one single thing. You won't turn us loose. You're not going to back off. You won't give up until we are the spiritual people you want us to be. And Lord, there's some of us here today. You want to do a phenomenal miracle through us that'll shake our community so a witness can be given. You want to do something called love so powerful, love so unbending, love that just is all wrapped up in you, and love that just spills from the heart of God. Jesus, would you make my life, I'm begging you, God, would you make my life a stage for something so phenomenal that my community will just wake up and say, whoa, and somebody can give a witness for Jesus. Would you knock the socks off of my community by what you do in my life? Would you march into my family, and would you be so overwhelmingly great within my life that my family would just, oh. Come on, God. Let a power take place that's beyond me. I crave that in my life. And I beg you today, God, don't let me become like these boys. They keep shutting you down. And their big concern is, what will it look like? We'd have to admit we're wrong. And their pride so got in the way, God, that they had to stick with a wrong decision even though they knew it was wrong. They had to stay with it lest they would admit they were wrong. Break us, God. Until the middle of humility, you could move within and through us to do the opposite of what happened in this scene. And I think of the Lord, what would have taken place if this Sanhedrin had said, oh, we've been wrong, and if they all gotten on their knees and given their lives to Christ, there would have been an evangelistic movement that would have affected our kids today, even today. Well, heads are bowed. Here we are, folks. Jesus has come after you again. He wants to take you to the next step, move you to another level, bring you into the intimacy that He's dreamed of. Will you let Him? Well, what do I have to do to that, to receive that? You got to admit you're wrong. What's the problem with that? Moments of seeking. Altar's open. Want to join me?